Well, good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diasporas first singularly hosted event of the 2021-22 academic year. My name is Mike Gomez. I'm the director of the center. The acronym is CSOD, and I'm delighted that you can be with us this evening. The title of our session for the evening comes from a book written by our guests. The name of the book is From Here to Equality: Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, published in 2020. And so here is the cover. And so we are delighted to have with us this evening two distinguished scholars, Dr. Kirsten Mullen, who is a folklorist and the founder of Artifactual and Arts Consulting Practice, and Carolina Circuit Writers, a literary consortium that brings expressive writers of color to the Carolinas. She was a member of the Freelon Ajaya Bond concept development team that was awarded the Smithsonian Institution's commission to design the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Under the auspices of the North Carolina Arts Council, she worked to expand the Coastal Folklife Survey. As a faculty member with the Community Folklife Documentation Institute, she trained students to research and document the state's African American music heritage. Dr. Mullen was a consultant on the North Carolina Museum of History's North Carolina Legends and Civil Rights exhibition projects. Her writing can be found in museum catalogs and journals and in commercial media, and includes Black Culture and History Matter, written for the American Prospect, which examines the politics of funding Black cultural institutions. And she is, of course, the co-author of From Here to Equality: Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, published by UNC Press in 2020. The other co-author, of course, is William A. Sandy Darity, who is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies, and Economics at Duke University. Professor Darity's research focuses on inequality by race, class, and ethnicity, stratification economics, schooling, and the racial achievement gap. He was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences from 2011 to 2012 at Stanford, a fellow at the National Humanities Center between 1989 and 90, and a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors in 1984. He received the Samuel Z. Westerfield Award in 2012 from the National Economic Association, that organization's highest honor, and he has published or edited over 12 books and published more than 210 articles in professional journals. We could go on and on with the bona fides of Professors Mullen and Darity, but for the sake of the purpose of our coming together this evening, which is to afford you maximum opportunity to engage with the authors of the book, we will proceed. So what we're going to do now is to allow Drs. Mullen and Darity to summarize the book for us. And then I want to take a little time to ask my own questions of the authors. And then we want to reserve a lot of time for you, the participants in the session, to both raise questions and to offer commentary. In that regard, you'll have two opportunities or two ways to do that. You can state your question or comment in the chat room, and hopefully we'll be able to get to it so that we can read it for you. But you will also be able to speak. Ms. Taylor, who is the coordinator and administrator for CSOD will unmute your mic and allow you to do that. So I think the procedure is you'll need to raise your hand so we can recognize that symbol and then allow you to have your say. So that's how we're going to proceed, and we are just excited and delighted to have the authors with us. We wanted to do this last year, and COVID, of course, had other ideas. So here we are, and I want to now turn the floor over to Dr. Mullen and Dr. Darity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gomez, for that generous introduction. I'd like to say first, while I'm an independent scholar, I'm not a PhD, but I want to begin by starting, like, what is the case for reparations? What is the case for reparations? So in the opening pages of From Here to Equality, we describe reparations as a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. By acknowledgement, we mean the recognition and admission of culpability on the part of the perpetrators of the atrocity. Acknowledgement. Redress is the act of restitution for heinous acts committed by the perpetrators. Closure is the victim's agreement that the perpetrator has met the debt owed and no further claims will be made unless there is a renewal of the harm or an infliction of a new harm. Now, in the case of African-American reparations, the objective is to achieve restitution for living Black Americans. Black American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States bear the weight of damage produced by the cumulative intergenerational effects of 3 phases of American history. These are the atrocities associated with the periods of slavery, legal segregation, and white terrorism, blithely referred to as Jim Crow, and the era following the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of the mid-1960s, mass incarceration, police executions of unarmed Blacks, ongoing discrimination in access to employment, credit, and housing, and the Black-white gulf in wealth. With respect to the chasm in Black and white wealth, in 2019, the Federal Reserve Board's survey of consumer finances indicated that the average Black household had a net worth approximating $840,000 lower than the average white household in the United States. Correspondingly, Black American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States constitute about 12% of the nation's population, but they possess less than 2% of the nation's wealth. This immense differential in wealth dramatically restricts Black Americans' ability to survive and thrive. It denies Black Americans the effective rights of full citizenship. An individual's or a household's wealth status, more powerfully than their income level, dictates the scope of opportunity to fulfill personal dreams and ambitions and to maintain economic security. What are some of the opportunities wealthier families can take advantage of? Greater capacity to finance elite, independent school and college education, access to capital and to start a business. They can finance expensive medical procedures, reside in neighborhoods with higher amenities, exert political influence through campaign financing, purchase expert counsel if confronted with an expensive legal system. Importantly, wealthier families can leave a bequest and or withstand financial hardship resulting from any number of emergencies. Put simply, wealth provides financial agency over one's life. It gives individuals and families choice, and it provides economic security to take risks and shield against financial loss. Finally, wealth is iterative. It provides people with the necessary initial capital to purchase an appreciating asset, which in turn generates more and more wealth and can be passed from one generation to the next.
We like to the phrase, wealth begets wealth. And the issue that we're going to raise in the context of the case for reparations that we build is the way in which wealth accumulating opportunities have been truncated from the onset of the existence of the United States as a republic for Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved here. We are encouraged somewhat by a change that has taken place in American attitudes about reparations. If we go back to the year 2000, the very beginning of the current century, a study that was done by Ravenna Popoff and Michael Dawson at the University of Chicago found that only 4% of white Americans endorsed monetary payments to Black Americans as reparations for a history of injustice. And let me repeat, that is for F-O-U-R. About 4 years ago, that percentage had risen to 16, still relatively low, but in comparison with the original 4%, a major change, a marked change. And indeed, in the most recent polls that we've seen, the numbers are now approaching 30% of white Americans endorsing monetary payments to Black Americans for reparative justice. In addition, recent polls indicate that approximately 39% of white people today support the creation of a commission to study reparations proposals for African Americans and provide Congress with a legislative roadmap for restitution. This particular piece of legislation that is actually in play in Congress at the present moment is known as House Resolution 40, HR 40. It's also labeled Senate Resolution 40. And it actually has bill status now because the legislation was finally reported out of the House Judiciary Committee after approximately 30 years in April 2021. Now, our perspective is a little bit skeptical about this piece of legislation. The bill has been a placeholder for 3 decades, and it is an opportune time to ensure that it can become an effective vehicle for true reparations. We don't believe that the way in which it's currently written, it will function as an effective vehicle for true reparations. It gives the proposed commission arbitrary and complete discretion over the content of the reparations proposals that are ultimately put forward to Congress. This increases the possibility that it will fail to deliver true justice. More than 30 years after this bill has been introduced, we have learned a great deal about how we should structure a plan for Black reparations. And that's one of the central objectives of the final chapter of our book, is to actually present a plan for reparations that could be executed by the federal government. If a congressional commission on reparations is established, it should be directed to produce a plan that meets what we now know are essential requirements for a program of reparations. Yeah.
So the 40 in the bill's title, HR 40, is a nod to the 40-acre land grants each emancipated household was promised at the end of the Civil War. That promise was unfulfilled. In contrast, from 1862 to 1938, the active program of the Homestead Act granted land to 1.5 million white American households. So this was 160-acre land grants from the government through the Homestead Acts. Actually, the last Homestead Act patent was completed in 1980 for property in Alaska. So, you know, these were assets that established the foundation for today's immense Black-white wealth gulf. So you've got massacres, you've got the Federal Home Administration and GI Bill in the 20th century. But in the 19th century, you had the Homestead Act. You know, this is a program where the federal government was actively helping white Americans, including recent immigrants from Europe, build wealth while simultaneously disinvesting in Black Americans. So to establish the material basis for Black citizenship, we must eliminate this wealth chasm. So given this objective, There are 4 components of a Black reparations plan that are essential. The first is eligibility. Eligible recipients should be Black Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, descendants of those who were denied the promised 40 acres. This would encompass 90% of the Black population, or approximately 40 million persons. So to establish eligibility, an individual must satisfy 2 criteria. First, they must meet the lineage standard. As we said, at least one of their forebears was enslaved. And then second, they must meet an identity standard. Individuals must provide proof that they have self-identified as Black, African-American, Afro-American, or Negro on an official document at least 12 years prior to the enactment of a reparations program or the enactment of a reparations commission, whichever comes first. Reducing the wealth disparity. The Black-white wealth differential is a powerful economic indicator of the cumulative intergenerational effects of structural racism on living descendants of slaves. Compounding the initial denial of 40 acres, throughout the succeeding century of legal segregation, white terrorism prevailed in dozens of communities, including Elaine, Arkansas, Wilmington, North Carolina, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Oakland, Florida, where Blacks had gained a toehold in local politics and built commercial and residential districts. They were the targets of violent property seizures and massacres by whites. In the 20th century, wealth accumulation for a broad swath of Americans shifted from land ownership to home ownership. The government promoted access to home ownership on a racialized basis. From restrictive covenants to redlining to the discriminatory application of the GI Bill and distribution of the Federal Housing Administration's mortgage loans, Black people were systematically denied resources white people readily used to become homeowners. We've estimated that it will require at least $11 trillion to bring the Black share of wealth at least into proportion with the Black share of the US population. So direct payments is the third pillar. For both symbolic and substantive reasons, a reparations plan must involve direct payments, whether via trust accounts, cash transfers, or other types of assets, to eligible recipients. Other proposals using reparations to establish a scholarship or a community-wide program risk not reaching those who merit redress. Scholarships are hardly the silver bullet. Black heads of household with a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of white heads of household who dropped out of high school. Community-wide programs will not measure up in a world where gentrification is rapidly changing local demographics. And lastly, the federal government must pay the bill. The federal government alone is capable of paying the bill, and as a culpable party, the entity that created and maintains the Black-white wealth gap, it should pay the bill. Full restitution for Black American descendants of slavery in the United States will require serious, sustained effort, and we are encouraged that community organizations, communities of faith, some colleges and universities are championing the cause. Suddenly many organizations are announcing their support of reparations and laying out initiatives, but there are some traps or minefields ahead. And Sandy will talk about those in some detail.
There are 2 levels of obstacles for a reparations plan in the United States. One set of obstacles is a consequence of there being some Americans who just are absolutely opposed to the idea of restitution for Black American descendants of US slavery. And they raise a host of arguments that we think are easily responded to. And we invest a significant amount of time in the book trying to address some of those types of arguments. We have a chapter 12, which is specifically written for the purpose of trying to address some of these arguments. So that's one set of obstacles that's associated with the people who are pure opponents to reparations. On the other hand, there's a set of obstacles that are associated with the conception of reparations that other individuals hold who are actually supportive of the idea. And we think that this is probably where the real substantive conversation has to take place, particularly if we're going to create a condition in which there is substantial support for reparations in a very uniform and unified way across the Black community itself. So what are some of these obstacles? Well, one of the obstacles that Kirsten mentioned and that I mentioned is associated with the unqualified support that so many people are giving to HB 40, which is a piece of legislation that's weak conceptually, but is also weak for some structural reasons that we'll be glad to share if people are interested during the question and answer period. A second problem that is associated with advocates of reparations is the emergence of a series of local and state level initiatives that are being given the label reparations. And this would include what has taken place in Evanston, Illinois, which from our perspective is essentially a housing voucher program. It's not an act of reparations. This would include the initiatives that may emerge from the state task forces that have been established in New York and in California that are supposed to be designing some form of reparations actions. The problem that we have with this is these are initiatives that cannot meet the goal of eliminating the racial wealth gap. They simply cannot. Not for the most part, not for any individual city, and certainly not collectively for all the states and municipalities in the United States. We've estimated that the minimal requirement for a reparations program is somewhere in the vicinity of $11 trillion. The combined budgets of all state and local governments in the United States is less than $3.5 trillion. So for the state and local governments to actually meet the minimum requirement for a reparations bill, they would have to devote their entire budgets to a reparations fund for upwards of 4 consecutive years. And this would mean that they could not provide any of the normal services that they offer to their constituents. I mean, this is beyond fantastic. And so, so from our perspective, state and local governments simply do not have the capability of meeting the requirements for a reparations plan. But also, as Kirsten has pointed out, it is the federal government that is the culpable party. It is the federal government that bears the ultimate responsibility for the history of atrocities that have taken place. In addition, advocates of reparations sometimes say, well, it should be more than a check, that a check is not enough. And, from our perspective, of course, there are other things that must be done. There are things that must be done to eliminate structural racism in the United States. On the other hand, elimination of structural racism is not the same thing as compensating for its effects. And even if we were not to eliminate structural racism in its entirety, there still would be a debt to be paid associated with the impact and consequences of structural racism. And indeed, in our notion of reparations as including closure as a component, closure will not satisfactorily take place unless there is not a continuation of the atrocities that have taken place in the past or an extension to new atrocities. And then the final thing that we like to mention that sometimes is stated by people who otherwise portray themselves as being in support of reparations is what we call the log rolling phenomenon, which is, there are all these other communities in the United States that have been subjected to atrocities. What about them? And our answer is yes. If there are other communities that have been subjected to atrocities, by all means, bring forward their claims for reparations. We're certainly very, very happy that For example, the Japanese American community received reparations payments for their unjust incarceration during the course of World War II. So by all means, bring forward those claims. Just don't wrap them into the claim that is being made by Black American descendants of US slavery, because of the unique array of atrocities and the particular way in which restitution must be paid to address the massive gap in wealth between Black and white Americans.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Mullen, and I'm going to call you Professor Mullen anyway, because that was your status at one point, and Darity. That is wonderful, and I want to once again recommend to the audience your book, From Here to Equality. It is a well-written book. It is a comprehensive examination of this question. You painstakingly go through moments in American history at which times there was that opportunity to do something about the structural inequalities, and a different path was taken. And you take us through, epoch by epoch in the American saga, and how different decisions were made. And so it's a well-researched book. It's a well-written book. I would like to now take a few minutes to ask a couple of questions, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience. And once again, audience, you have two methods of engaging with the authors. You can put questions into the chat, or you can raise your hand, the symbol for the raised hand, and ask to be recognized so that you can speak with your own voice and make your contribution. So we'll have plenty of time for that, I do believe. I would say that in listening to your overview, your synopsis, and your major, the disquisition of your major arguments, there is a kind of optimistic tone to your presentation this evening. I was particularly struck with the survey that says that's almost 40% of white Americans are in support of a commission to study reparations. And that's a segue for my first question for you. Indeed, the beginning of your book takes into account what was arguably a growing momentum for reparations, reflected in partial to full support among some of the Democratic presidential candidates. But since the defeat of the former president, Donald Trump, the US, by all accounts, has become far more partisan. We have witnessed the transformation of the Republican Party into a personal appendage. It's become radicalized. Some are within the party are bent on insurrection. State legislatures in some 48 states have already or are considering enacting nearly 400 laws that will in some way disenfranchise Black and brown voters. Those same legislators are busy gerrymandering congressional districts to advantage for 2022 and 2024. A substantial percentage of Republicans continue to believe that the 2020 presidential election was quote unquote stolen and therefore fraudulent. So stated differently, we're in the throes of yet another quote unquote white backlash, arguably first experienced with the end of Reconstruction and again in the 1960s following the passing of the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. So given this toxic, inflamed political climate, how likely is it that meaningful headway can be made toward realizing reparations?
So great question. And, I would say we're in fairly treacherous times. I'm not sure that the degree of partisanship is more severe
Right.
in the aftermath of the election than it was before the election took place. The central issue that you're raising is the question of whether or not the United States will continue to be a nation that is dominated by minority rule. And the attempted coup on January 6th was clearly an effort to install a government in place that would be a representative of the minority of the population. And so that's a serious issue. We don't think that the current Congress is likely to pass a bill for true reparations. And so we have a struggle ahead of us, and it's a struggle essentially for whether or not the United States actually behaves as a democratic nation or not. And that's the big fight that's ahead of us, and that is a fight that will accompany the effort to try to introduce true reparations. I'm not sure, you might have some other thoughts about that.
But I was just going to agree that we've been in this protracted bipartisan moment for at least 12 years. This is not new, but Sandy's absolutely right. Only after the current Congress has been turned. Not in that direction, but will we see any kind of traction on reparations? We are encouraged by the groundswell of interest that's been expressed. The conversation has been sustained for several years now, which is unprecedented in my lifetime. This was a political hot potato that politicians dared not speak the R word for fear of being laughed off stage, and yet the conversation has continued. And when politicians attempt to dodge the conversation, they are looked on in a negative way. That's new. We have no idea whether the trend that was observed in the recent polls will continue, but the trend is moving in the right direction. And we do find that incredibly encouraging. But also, younger people are very much energized by this movement and are, seeking not only to learn more about the nation's history, recognizing that, they weren't necessarily told the full picture of our country's history. They certainly have not been made aware of the 100 plus white riots that took place, nor were they aware of what the consequences were. Not only were the political, in many of those instances, the reasons for the riot started with Black political figures being elected, legally elected to both municipal and state level government, and the white elite and their supporters were not content simply to overturn those elections. They also, destroyed Black residential and commercial districts, and in many cases appropriated those properties after the Black residents had fled. In places like Fort Bend County, Texas, which had a white riot in 1888, the Democratic Party ruled Fort Bend County for the next 70 years. So the gains that these marauding whites got were substantial, and in many instances have not been shifted.
Yeah. The difficulty with the Republican Party, and I want to say, personally, I don't have an uncritical brief for the Democratic Party, but the difficulty with the Republican Party is that it is essentially the party of the Confederacy in 2021. That in the late 19th and then into most of the 20th century, the representation of the Confederacy was largely in the Democratic Party, but subsequent to, and I tend to describe Party today as not being the party of Lincoln, but it's the party of Strom Thurmond. But the Republican Party is explicitly an expression of the Lost Cause and Confederate sentiment. And the Confederacy was always predicated on minority rule of the United States.
Okay, very good. So I have two more questions for you, and then we're going to kind of, we open it up to the audience to participate. So you write, and I quote you, "It is customary in the American court system to assign monetary values for damages to human lives." And you, after assessing a number of approaches at quantification taken by various scholars, you settle on a remedy that calls for ending the current racial wealth disparity between whites and blacks, which in your estimates would require about $800,000 per black household, which is about $250,000 per capita, to be paid over a period of time, costing. And now I read 8 trillion, but Sandy, you said 7 trillion. So between, let's just split the difference.
The estimate now is about 11.
About 11 trillion.
11. Oh, so it's going up to 11. Okay, all right. But am I right with the $800,000 per black household? Is that
still a bit higher?
Well,
it's a little higher.
Closer to 840,000, but
840. Okay.
But I think that the size of households, you may be overestimating the size of a household. Okay. So the individual outlay would be closer to $325,000 to $350,000.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, but that's the ballpark.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that correction. You're the economist, and I'm the student in this situation. I certainly agree that there must be a financial component to a reparative response. But I'm not convinced that a financial remedy, no matter how substantial, is going to make black folk whole in a holistic sense. And I think that you've alluded to that. You've addressed that, given the fact that we've suffered. And you talk about this in the book. We've suffered so much trauma over the centuries, disconnected from our ancestry. We continue to be the special victims of the carceral state. Our children are not properly educated. We're treated like second-class citizens, and so forth and so on. Mm-hmm. It's also, however, far from clear to me, at least, that capitalism or the state can be divested of its racism. There is the argument, of course, that it's exploitative by design. So this is a structural problem that I would like to hear you address.
Let me start. Actually, I just want to jump in. So I want to say, first of all, reparations is a debt. It's a debt that's owed by the federal government. It's not this. The idea behind it is not that it's going to make Black people whole. This is a debt that the federal government owes and has owed for 156 years. Now, what the individual recipients do with those funds is up to them. If they choose to use part of those funds for therapy, if they choose to use part of those funds to acquire, a residence that gives them great pleasure, or to travel, to invest in their friends, invest in their communities, because that's something that gives them joy, then, for us, that's an inside job. That's not something that the government can do for you. But what the federal government can do and should do is pay this debt and make it possible for Black Americans to have the kind of wealth that enables them to dramatically improve their quality of life.
Yeah, there is a consideration that's related to the question that you raised earlier, which is the question of white minority violence. When the first considerations were given to the provision of 40-acre land grants to the formerly enslaved, it was fairly clear that had they received that land, it would have been important and imperative for the federal government to maintain the presence of the Union Army in the South and or arm the formerly enslaved, because there was going to be a violent response to the provision of land to them. And similarly, we could anticipate that there will be a minority of the U.S. population that may respond violently in the presence of a reparations program. And so their preparations must be made to address that. And so I think that's another important consideration in this context.
I think that so I understand the point, and you know, Robinson, in fact, you know, wrote that book, The Debt, which, you know, kind of, very much articulated, some of these issues, and you have built upon that. So I certainly accept the idea that, or the notion that the government owes a debt. I do think, however, that we need to think a little more about what else needs to go, what else needs to be discussed, what else needs to be addressed. So because ultimately the interest is that we are made whole. We have, for example, we have, if you take a look at some of these athletes, who make a whole lot of money, but they're not necessarily well educated in terms of how they use that money. My fear, let's assume that things work out in the Congress and we get the right, arrangement, and this money is approved, and so forth and so on. I would have a concern that, 30, 40 years down the road, we turn around and we're still facing some really serious problems.
Well, Kirsten's got some thoughts on this too, but I want to start by saying that one of the most important quotations that we share in From Here to Equality is from Malcolm X, where he talks about a situation where somebody has stabbed him in the back with a knife 9 inches. Mm-hmm. And he makes a distinction between the process of pulling the knife out, which is essential. Mm-hmm. If he's going to survive, the knife does need to be taken out. Right. But he distinguishes between pulling the knife out and healing the wound. And so from our perspective, this whole set of steps that must be taken to eliminate the conditions that produce structural racism are the equivalent of pulling the knife out. On the other hand, the question of compensation for the harms that have been done by structural racism is the equivalent of healing the wound. And from our point of view, the act of reparations is healing the wound. So it's not the only thing that needs to be done, but it's a critical thing that can be done. And one of the things that we think is a possibility is if you provide sufficient resources in this process of healing the wound, individuals who are Black in the United States can exercise political influence in a way in which they never have been able to do before, that would lead to the reduction in the conditions of structural racism. So we certainly think actions must be taken to break apart the apparatus of racism in the United States. But we also think that there is a possibility for individuals who are receiving an act of reparative justice that is financial to exercise their political influence in such a way that structural racism will be diminished significantly.
I want to talk about 2 points. Certainly there is a place for racial equity initiatives, and this may be what you are thinking about. There are a number of cities, our hometown of Durham, North Carolina is one, that created a commission to look at these kinds of issues and think about what kinds of programs, what kinds of plans the city could put in place, basically to address the concerns of Black people that they have ignored for decades, if not centuries. In essence, these are programs where cities have an opportunity to do what they should have done in the first place. But there is a lot of opportunity for goodwill or making progress of the type that you are suggesting. Programs that might have to have everything from cognitive therapy, affordable housing projects, just that whole panoply of things that have made it difficult for people who don't have wealth to survive and thrive. But the other thing I wanted to say is this whole question of athletes and other Black people making bad decisions about how they spend their money. Why? I guess my question would be: are you as concerned about other groups that make bad financial choices? I don't know that Black athletes are any more profligate, any more likely to make decisions that you deem to be reckless than are any other group. It's important to us that reparations payments be made directly to individuals and not to some third party that is given the authority to invest those monies or manage those monies on their behalf, or that they be put towards programs that may or may not benefit the eligible recipients. Now, we're not opposed to financial literacy programs. We even talked about sort of pre-reparations preparation, to give people an opportunity to learn more about investing, to learn more about saving, if they are so inclined. But again, we don't think necessarily this should be a requirement. I don't know when reparations for Japanese Americans were being finalized, or if when reparations for victims of the Holocaust were being finalized, people said, oh, well, what happens if they just, spend the money irresponsibly? The point was, this is the debt that's owed, and the money should be given to them directly. And how they spend that money is their business.
Yeah, I would push back a little bit. And I think that in the estimate of we were talking about Black athletes, in the estimate of the Black athletes themselves, many of them have, by their own admission, have made poor choices. To the extent that other people make poor choices, of course, people make poor choices. The question then becomes, I think for Black folks, I'm not so sure that we can, given the disparities, and given that we are seizing upon this kind of program to kind of close the gap. Yeah, I'm very concerned about rollout. And I think that we should all be concerned about putting into place every structure that we can think of to make this successful. And I would have to disagree with you that you just give a lump sum to people and it's up to them as to how what they do with it. But that's another matter. I want to go to my last.
We didn't actually say that it would necessarily be a lump sum.
Or whatever it is. I mean,
no. I mean, you could give it could be an asset that's less liquid. You could set it up such that individuals could spend the interest off of the principal. Yeah. You could stretch it over a 10 years. An annuity, for example.
You could do it as a trust account.
Yeah, that's fine.
There are a number of ways in which you could provide the funds to individuals, but ultimately give them discretion without necessarily providing them with a lump sum that would just be spent all at one time.
So that sounds like a concession to me that some kind of structure would probably be useful.
Yeah, but there's another motivation for that structure as well. That people are always asking us the classic question, and it's really actually become a somewhat annoying question, but how are you going to pay for this? They always ask. And our response is, well, you pay for it the same way in which the federal government paid for the stimulus packages that it provided during the course of the Great Recession. You pay for it in the same way that the federal government paid for the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan, which is you just pay for it. In fact, in all three of those instances, the federal government did not raise taxes for the purposes of obtaining the funds. It essentially created the money. at its own behest. And it can do that because it's a sovereign currency issuer, unlike the state and local governments. Now, but the issue that arises when you do that is whether or not you trigger significant inflation. And so another reason why we have thought about ways in which we might put restraints on the period of payout is because we want to try to limit the risk of inflation also. So it's not just a question of whether or not we think people will do dumb things with the money. And you know, there's a tremendous urban mythology about people doing stupid things with lottery winnings. And so, and even arguments about people dying early because, well, we tried to do a systematic investigation of lottery recipients' outcomes at the Cook Center. And one of the things that we found was that the primary thing that most lottery winners do with the funds is they provide resources, frequently in the form of a trust account for their children and their grandchildren. Now, we can't say anything about what the children and grandchildren ultimately do with the money, but it strikes us that the fact that the recipients of the lotteries make provisions for subsequent generations is hardly something that we would deem a frivolous use of the funds.
Well, my emphasis is not on the issue of frivolity. My issue has to do with, what else goes along with settling the debt. I mean, I think that's and I am interested and invested in wholeness. But I want to ask a final question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And here I think we may part ways, Sandy and Kirsten. You're quite explicit that of the two criteria a person must meet to receive reparations, one is that the person must have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the US after the beginning of the Republic. This is a position that seems to be consistent with that of ADOS, the acronym for American Descendants of Slavery. The book offers no explanation or rationale for this requirement. And I want to give you an opportunity to explain your thinking on this, and I want to engage you on this.
We can actually give an explanation, and that is we're focused on the descendants of the Black people who, upon emancipation, were promised and then denied those 40-acre land grants.
And that's the site.
That is the site of the origination of the debt. If they had been given those.
So, I'm sorry, you said that's what?
That's the site of the origination of the debt. That's where the racial wealth gap started.
Yes.
Okay. If they had been provided those 40-acre land grants, and importantly, if the federal government had protected them, which is to say, if they had, placed Union soldiers across the South and kept them in place so that they would not have been attacked by white mobs, they would have been able to, develop the land as they saw fit. I mean, a lot of that land was farmland. And if there was anything those Black people knew how to do, it was farm. They knew how to eke a living from the land. This is land that they could have.
Well, they'd already demonstrated that they could prior to the end of the Civil War under these federal experiments like the Port Royal experiment, et cetera.
The Davis-Bend experiment, where for, beginning in 1862, the federal government had, several locations where they had placed Black people on 40-acre land grants, on land parcels, I should say. And they had, developed the crops, successfully sold those crops to the federal government. And they were overwhelmingly successful. So they had a proof of concept that they could demonstrate. And this is land that they could subdivide, they could lease, any lumber, any livestock, on the land, it was yours to use or to sell. But most importantly, the land itself and any profits from the land could be passed on to the next generation. So the opportunity to have and create, a basis for intergenerational wealth is what was denied those Black people. While at the same time,
I understand that.
Hold on. While at the same time, you had white Americans, including recent immigrants from Europe, who received not 40-acre land grants, but 160-acre land grants. And they did profit, and they did pass those profits and the land itself down to their offspring. And this is why today, 25% of all living white Americans have a wealth position of at least $1 million.
Yes, no, that's I understand that, and so it seems that your position is that you want to, one of the criteria for participation in the reparations project is that an ancestor has to be has had to have been enslaved in the Republic, since the Republic period, because that's the origin of the damage. I don't know of any period in US history, either in the colonial period or the Republic, when African descendant people from the Caribbean, Latin America have not been in this country. These histories are, let me finish.
Numbers.
Let me
they
finish.
have not been in this country in significant numbers.
Let me finish.
It's a critical issue.
Well, but that even kind of makes my point, which is that these histories are intertwined. These histories are intertwined. African descendant people have been in this country in every period, and especially from other countries, and especially with the turn of the 20th century. Now, you say,
are their descendants not
intermarried?
Are their descendants not the children of folks who intermarried with Black Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved?
Well, that's true. Some of them are intermarried.
And they qualify.
But some of them,
under our system.
but some of them, but some of them are not. Some of them did not.
Okay, so I would be interested in seeing the individuals who are a pure line from the 17th century to the present moment, who have no connection to Black Americans.
Okay, so that begs the question: why would you make that? Why would you make that point then, if your position is that the vast majority of Black people in the country are in some way descended from slaves who were enslaved in this country?
Yeah, because we think that the individuals who have migrated to the United States since the passage of the civil rights legislation are not appropriate recipients of reparations.
Why is that?
Because A, these are individuals whose wealth position is not a consequence of the specific policies that were practiced internally to the United States.
But I mean, if they've been here
who do not have ancestors who were denied.
If they've been here since 1945, they have been impacted.
No. I said since the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s.
Okay, the 1960s then.
Less than 1%.
That's like 60 years ago.
Less than 1% of Americans who were Black in the United States prior to the 1960s were individuals who did not have an ancestor who was enslaved here.
So if that's your position, that people have come here from the Caribbean, people have come here from Latin America, I'm talking about African descendant people, and invariably they have intermixed with other Black people who have descendants from ancestors from slavery. In this country, I don't understand why you make the point. What is the purpose of making the point?
But the point that
it seems like what you're saying is that you want to cut off the benefits from anyone who comes in since 1964,
unless they want to make a separate case for reparations.
What? But
which is fine.
You just said that these are folks who have intermarried.
No,
And
you
our
said
point
that.
with Black Americans,
No, you said that.
and we're saying those people would be eligible.
Their
I
children
understand.
and
I
grandchildren would be
understand
all
that
be
logic.
eligible.
I understand that logic. But you have communities in this country from the Caribbean, Latin America, African descended people who have not necessarily intermarried with conventionally defined African Americans. Why? But they have been in many instances subjected to racism, ongoing, discrimination. These are the other two criteria that you mentioned in your book as the basis for. Wait a minute.
I'm a little bit confused. Did they come as slaves or not?
Yeah.
No, wait. They didn't necessarily come to this country as slaves.
Right.
All right.
So part of what we're saying.
So that's the point. That's the point I'm making. Why did they have to come? So
there's two things.
No, wait. Can I ask?
There's a difference between coming to this country voluntarily for opportunity that we would say, and this is true for Blacks or white immigrants,
right.
Opportunity that was created on the backs of Black American slaves.
Right.
There's a big difference. Please let me finish. We're talking about people who were brought here in shackles, not people who said, oh, America's a great place to be. This is a great place for my kids to get an education. Things may not have turned out exactly the way they planned, but they came here for the opportunity they saw on the ground. Now, all of these individuals are eligible for reparations, but not necessarily from the U.S. government.
Why is that?
If your ancestors were, they are eligible for reparations from the countries that colonized and enslaved.
Why can't they be eligible for reparations from the U.S.?
Please allow me to finish. They are eligible for reparations from the countries, the nations that colonized and enslaved their ancestors.
But why can't they be?
You may be aware.
Why can't they be eligible for both?
I'm trying to make the point. You may be aware that CARICOM has been created and one of the objectives of CARICOM is to seek reparations for, Black residents of the Caribbean.
Yeah, I understand that.
Including Black Americans in their charge.
Yeah.
No, they don't. Nor should they.
That doesn't. Wait a minute. Wait a minute.
By the same token, Black Americans should not be compelled to include all these other groups in their.
This is you know what? This is where we part. Because this is just this is an embrace of a kind of imperial structure in which we, divide ourselves into these arbitrary and false divisions. And I don't have a problem with Black folks collecting reparations from the U.S., from Britain, from France, from all over, because you know what? All of them were involved in the slave trade. And they brought us, and they dropped us all over the hemisphere.
So then,
so what I'm saying is,
then I would ask: Are you suggesting that CARICOM do the same thing? So
let me say this:
Are you suggesting that CARICOM
when I have that
Black Americans in their claim for reparations?
Okay. When I have that conversation with Hillary Beckles, I will certainly encourage him to do so.
Well, that would be
and as I am encouraging you,
because this is hear what the outcome of that conversation
is.
Yeah. But this is the point.
I certainly don't think
why does it matter? Why does it matter to what?
Let me say something.
I'm in support of Black folk getting money from all of them.
Well, that's fine. That's fine, but presumably the folks in the Congo get the money from the Belgians, the folks in Jamaica get the money from the UK, and those of us who are descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States get the money from the United States government.
Yeah, but this is the thing. I want to go back to your 3 points because in one of your book, one of your responses to the critique that in the case of the Nazi Holocaust, and in the case of the Japanese, reparations went to living people. Your response was that there are still people living in this country who went through Jim Crow and racism, ongoing racism. That was your defense, okay?
That was one of our defenses. In fact, in both of those cases, individuals who were heirs did receive reparations.
Yeah.
No, that's fine, but no, but you,
Americans and the victims of the Holocaust.
Yeah, so
You
it's
state-
not the
you
case
Just the
state-
case that
that it was
that-
only living persons got the money.
I didn't say that.
Oh, we
But
misunderstood.
you
Sorry.
said, I mean, what I said was that in response to that question.
Yeah, we said that
You-
both
you
we
state-
made
you-
both responses.
Yeah, but this is the point, and you're trying to
Okay.
get it around. Okay, and that is that one of your rationale for defending the proposition that the descendants of people who were traumatized, who themselves were not necessarily enslaved, are eligible for reparations is that people continue to have this experience in this country. And what
Yes,
I'm
the
saying
people-
to you,
The people
let me
who are
finish.
descendants of persons enslaved. in
It's
this-
not just
in
the
this
people who
country.
are descendants of people who were enslaved in this country.
Yeah,
You have
but
black,
David,
you have black, you
that-
have black,
That's the only
you have
community.
black
that-
people, you have
that's the
black
only
people
co-
in this, you have
Michael,
black people in this
Michael,
country who are
that's
from the
the-
Caribbean, Latin America.
Absolutely,
so-called,
the
who've made
police shoot
enormous
everybody.
contributions to this country.
Absolutely true. The
Why
police
would you,
shoot
why would you,
everybody
why
that's
would you
black.
cut them off from
But
this?
Michael, it's only the Black American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States who have a particular historical mechanism that has led to the current racial wealth gap. Individuals who have migrated to the country more recently bring a different historical process,
It's been a
generating
related
the
historical process.
resources that they bring when they come into the United States.
And believe me, the United States, the Yankees have profited enormously from Caribbean and Latin American labor, even while they were laboring in Latin America and the Caribbean.
No
argument there. No argument there.
Okay, so why?
If
So
somebody
then why?
wants to
So
bring a case
so
for reparations
so the
on that
Yankees have
basis,
profited from
please do.
exploiting labor in the Caribbean and Latin America. Why don't they owe those people?
They might, and if
They
somebody
do.
wants to, if somebody wants to bring a case for reparations on that basis,
Why can't you
please
include?
do it.
But that's not the case that we're bringing. That's not the case that we're bringing.
We are not bringing a case
Yeah.
for everybody who has a complaint against the United States.
Well, you should. Everybody, you
Who wrote
this
one book.
this program should be expansive.
When the
and should
Japanese
include
Americans
every
brought their
African
case,
descended person in this country.
when the Japanese Americans brought their case for reparations,
I'm not talking
No
about
one
the
asked.
Japanese Americans.
no,
I'm talking
hold
about
on,
black
listen to what I say.
Hold on.
No one asked, what about group X, Y, and Z?
I'm not talking
Nor
about them.
should
I'm
they
asking
have.
about this. I'm asking you about black people now.
That's
And
right.
I'm saying that we are a series of
and we're
related
responding
communities.
to you.
You know, one of the things that we had some
This is
very,
a kind of Yankee, Americanization of the process.
we've had some very,
So,
some very,
are you saying that there's nothing unique about the particular array of atrocities that have occurred in the United States?
I'm saying that they're all related,
are
sir. They're
particular
all
to the
related.
folks who were enslaved here?
And I am saying, I am not saying that, this is what I'm saying. Based upon what you write, slavery is not the only criterion for reparations.
Yeah,
That's what you
absolutely.
wrote. That's
It's
what
not
you
the
wrote.
only cause for reparations.
No, that's
correct.
no, right. No.
Yeah.
You specifically state, all right, that the damages arise from slavery, from Jim Crow, from ongoing racism. And what
we're
I'm
looking
saying
at the community that has suffered
Experience
all of those effects,
right.
not
Not just
communities
one.
that have
Not just
entered the
one.
country and are experiencing contemporary racism.
okay, we're going to stop here because we're not going to agree on this. But
No, we're not.
but I very much appreciate your effort.
And
I
somebody put
appreciate the
in the
book. I
chat,
appreciate the research. I appreciate the struggle.
so Michael, let me ask an odd question.
Mhm.
Under our criteria, would you be eligible?
On my mother's side, yes. On my
All right.
father's side, no.
So
You
there's
only need one.
that's
You only need one.
there's the intermarriage. Yeah,
You're
so
in.
that does it.
That's your but that's according to what you say.
That's our criteria.
Okay, but what I'm saying is that
Speak to
as
our
black people need to have a conversation about this and it cannot be limited to conventional African Americans.
Well,
Everybody
I
needs to
certainly
be
hope
a
that you
part.
carry your point of view to the folks in CARICOM who are operating on a very different set of principles.
I have no issue with that. And as a matter of fact, I'll make this last point. And this is an enormous task. Okay. And so I appreciate what you've done, and I appreciate the effort. But ultimately, we are going to have to see this as a conjoined project to bring the whole of the West to account for what has happened to us. And it's not just a matter of, this nation state and that nation state. All right. Because even, just to take it a step further, conventionally defined African Americans are owed a debt by Britain and Germany. Why is that? Because the Industrial Revolution wasn't that based on the cotton that was harvested down in the South?
Well, you can make that case. That's a different one from the one we're making.
I know I can make the case, but what I'm saying
we are making a very targeted case that is intentionally pointed at the United States government for a set of atrocities that were directed at a specific segment of the U.S. population.
All right.
And it's linked. No, this is the important point.
We need to get to the,
also after this.
It's linked to the question of which community was denied full citizenship in the United States as a consequence of the country's racist trajectory.
okay.
And that is the Black American community that was subjected to slavery in this country.
Well, I think you have it.
We're making a case for the material conditions for full citizenship in the United States.
All right.
And this is in contrast, for example, with the Native American reparations claim, which we presume is for sovereignty.
Well, you said something about the need for unity, and I would absolutely say yes. We support a unified effort. But what we have discovered is that when you put all these groups together, instead of strengthening the cause, it tends to dramatically weaken it.
I don't know what that means, but okay, we're going to go ahead to the chat.
No, well,
the question
when you're talking to politicians, they're like, well, why are you bringing up these people in the Caribbean? When we had conversations with some of the architects of the Japanese American redress movement, one of the lessons that we learned is that specificity really matters. It was extremely important to be able to explain which communities you're talking about and why. And, so initially they had a much broader conception of who they were fighting to receive redress. The United States had actually incarcerated Japanese Latinos, and they were initially included in that movement. But groups like the Japanese American Citizens League recognized that this was not going to fly.
Okay.
The hope was that eventually they could bring those groups in, which they did do down the road. But they recognized that they needed to be very clear about which groups they were advocating for. And that's what we're saying.
And the citizenship dimension is really important.
We can share research methodology, we can share strategies, and we can advocate for each other, but the causes need to stay separate.
Thank you so much. We've overran our, we've gone on and on. And I want to get to the Q&A. There are some questions here. Let me do this. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to speak? Who would like to ask a question? Okay, here's someone with a hand up. Ms. Taylor, can you handle? There's a hand up, and I don't know who this person is. Oh, Leela Edwards Kemp.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
I had, based on the discussion you guys were having earlier about the link between Afro-Caribbean and African-American communities. If I'm not mistaken, were there not slaves that were being transported between the two communities? So in what way would you guys be able to distinguish, okay, and also considering the fact that there may be records that were not taken down, how would you guys establish the criteria for who is and isn't eligible Because
So,
there is a
I'm
gray
assuming
area.
those are two separate questions. One question is
Yes.
about what type of data or evidence is needed to establish eligibility.
Yes.
And the other question is about the circulation of slaves between the Caribbean and the United States.
Yes.
Yeah. So with respect to the latter, the question is, where do the descendants of the individuals who were landed in one location or the other currently live? But I would also say I would be interested in having somebody give me an estimate of the numbers in which that took place, because in the aftermath of abolition of the trade, there wasn't any significant amount of shipping of human beings from the United States to other parts of the world. The transactions all took place internally to the United States because the importation process was no longer being continued, at least not legally. So would you like to talk about how people might establish eligibility?
Well, again, we're talking about census records, and we know that when you go back to the 1860s, you're not going to see the names of Black people. But if you're a descendant of someone who is old enough to have been living in 1860 or 1850, say, but they show up in the 1870 census, then it's fairly clear that that individual had been enslaved.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we propose,
it's their absence.
it's the absence from the
1850 or
1860s, like that gives you the aha. But one of the things that we propose is that agencies be created with professional genealogists who would provide their services free of charge to help individuals, determine whether or not they're eligible.
Okay, thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, we have a question from the chat from Tara Jones. What about white families in the U.S. today who owe their wealth to the labor of enslaved people? How do they factor into reparations?
Well, they don't factor directly into the plan that we have in mind. I suppose if they would like to make some type of contribution to the process, if they would like to be engaged in the process of dismantling structural racism, that would be fantastic. But the plan that we have in mind requires financing that goes well beyond the capacity of individual donors. What was it? We estimated that if individual donors kicked
In $1 million?
No, $1 billion in on a monthly basis, it would take 9 centuries to get to $11 trillion. So this is really a project that has to be funded by the federal government. But if there are white families who feel a sense of obligation because of their particular family histories, then there's any number of ways in which they can be supportive of this project, including supporting having the federal government introduce a comprehensive national program of reparations.
Thank you for the question.
Okay, we have another comment in the chat from Gray Jones. Please recognize the process already put in place for successful reparations being delivered. Asking for every single atrocity to be paid for in one bill is a guaranteed failure and has been proven time and time again.
That's precisely why we say we want to use the racial wealth gap as the indicator of the cumulative intergenerational effects of American racism, and that should be the basis for calculating the bill, rather than trying to enumerate each single atrocity and add it up. I mean, that's strongly our motivation for focusing on the racial wealth gap.
Okay. All right. Let's see what else we have in the Q&A. Anyone else? We have a question from Professor Natalie Pierre. She writes, you mentioned HR 40 is both structurally and conceptually weak. Can you run through the reasons why it's conceptually weak?
Yes.
Well, I think we did, didn't we?
I'm happy to do it quickly. So there are four basic omissions in HR 40. HR 40 does not give the study commission a directive that will deliver true reparations. It does not, for example, identify who the eligible recipients are. As we said, those are Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, people who can identify at least one ancestor who had been enslaved in the United States, and individuals who self-identify as Black, African American, Afro-American, or Negro on an official document. HR 40 does not target the elimination of the racial wealth gap as its goal. HR 40 does not say that reparations should be made in the form of direct payments to the eligible recipients. And HR 40 does not say that the debt should be paid by the federal government. So those are four, major omissions in HR 40. Then there are also some structural concerns about the commission itself that
one of these is that the law as currently written says that the commission is not subject to the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And essentially the Federal Advisory Committee Act is the legislation that that mandates that commissions should operate in the daylight, that their deliberations, their papers, their communications should be available for public scrutiny. And the legislation as currently written provides an opportunity for the commission to operate in complete secrecy. So that's the first problem. Second problem is the legislation mandates that the commissioners would receive salaries of up to $172,000, the executive 4 level on the civil service scale. And we think that this is ethically a deep problem, that a commission of this type with this type of sacred mission should not be one in which individuals serve on it as a consequence of receiving a high salary.
Just to say just briefly, the California, right now, currently, the California Department of Justice Reparations Task Force is in operation, and they're going to be working for a little more than 2 years.
Yep.
They're not being paid.
Yep.
This is kind of the way commissions typically work. So why is this commission insisting on salaries of this amount?
70% of congressional commissions are commissions where the members do not receive any form of salary. Now, we of course are very, very receptive to the idea that the individual commission members should receive compensation for their normal expenses, but their staff should be paid a salary.
Absolutely.
The professional staff that works with them and supports them, but individually, I think that there's too much of an image of a money grab associated with the content of this proposal. And then
is the Congressional Black Caucus, they're aware of these structural issues?
That's a great question. That's a great.
Really know.
We don't know, because anytime we've encountered individuals in Congress who have talked about supporting the bill, we ultimately discovered that they really haven't actually read it.
I won't name this particular legislator, but this is someone who had signed on to the bill very early. And when we were talking about these concerns, the individual said, "How did you know that?" And I said, "It's in the bill." And the individual said, "Well, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to, I've got some work to do."
The most
people assume that because John Conyers, is and for good measure. I mean, John Conyers.
The bill is sort of this guiding light for reparations.
Right.
So people have automatically responded by supporting it without actually looking at its content.
I mean, the bill was written 30 years ago, and we know a lot more now about, how wealth has been created in this country. We know a lot more now about why it's imperative that this debt be paid. And all of that needs to be, applied to the bill as revisions, or scrap it and start with something fresh.
Well, I would also say that, the bill has been altered.
Yes.
And the most recent alterations are problematic. When the bill was first written, it provided for there being 7 commissioners.
Yes.
And then circa 2017, it was raised to 13, and now it's 15. It's really unwieldy. And then one of the really peculiar aspects of this is that 6 of the commission members would be named by the director of the commission. But in addition, as Kirsten pointed out, there's also a strange quorum rule where there are 15 commissioners, but a quorum is satisfied with 7 of the commissioners, which is less than a majority of the commission.
Not a majority, not a super majority,
Yeah.
but 7. That's odd. Like, why is that?
And then the final complaint that we raise about this is the law as it's currently written says that individuals who are elected officials or are civil servants cannot be appointed to the commission.
So no mayors, no governors, no cabinet members, no members of the House or the Senate.
Yeah,
Very unusual.
Which is very different
Very
from,
unusual.
from the commission that was set up to create the Japanese American reparations plan. Now, what is interesting about this, and this gets back to the money grab issue, if an individual is an elected official or a civil servant, they are not eligible to receive a salary. So by excluding them from the commission, all 15 potential members are eligible to receive these large salaries.
Well, we have 5 minutes left in our time together, and I'm wondering if either of you can just tell us where do we go from here? Where does the project, what's the next step?
Do you want to
You
start?
start, ugh. You start, please.
Well, okay, Kirsten's going to have something different to say, but I think that the next step is a step that's in progress,
Yes.
which is addressing the host of misperceptions that people have, not only about the history of slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, because we've been given a false narrative, particularly as a consequence of the efforts of the Daughters of the American Revolution and the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who have exercised a tremendous amount of influence over the content of history education, American history education in our nation's schools. So that's part of it. We have to address those misperceptions. The other misperceptions that we have to continue to address concern people's beliefs about why there's racial economic inequality in the United States. And there's a host of folks who have the view that the reason why Black folks have less economic resources than white folks is because Black folks make bad decisions or engage in dysfunctional ways. And one of the central messages of our book is no, these kinds of disparities are a consequence of public policy. Policies that have been actively conducted in the United States to enhance the position of white Americans to the detriment of Black Americans. And so those misperceptions have to be addressed as well. But Kirsten might have some comments about actions that people might take. Yeah.
I mean, I would say, that it's important for all of us to read HR or HB 40. It's a shorter piece of legislation than many. And it does have some arcane language in it, but it's a fairly short, fairly quick read, so that you can familiarize yourself with what the bill actually says. But I think it's important, to write Congress, to lobby and petition Congress, and ask for a national program of reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. I think, this is an opportunity to organize your formal and informal groups, your family, your study groups, your ultimate Frisbee groups, your book club. All of these folks can be, part of this movement. Write your own resolution and send it to Congress and sign it. But I think the other thing too is if you know folks who are on the fence, or if you are yourself or know others who are members of the wider diaspora. Talk to them about the importance of a coalition and let them know that you support the work that they are doing and you also support the work that's being done for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. It doesn't have to be an either or proposition. Both of these, initiatives can move forward. And, I think about how, Black Americans and others around the world, but especially Black American students, academics, were involved with the whole effort to end apartheid in South Africa. who were involved with the movement to, for any number of, African countries to seek independence from, European nations. This is another moment when we can have an omni effort, but keeping, staying in communication and supporting each other, but not, I think the best way to do that is to support. I mean, everyone is not. I certainly wouldn't pretend to know the issues of individuals, the specificity of individuals from the Caribbean, or from the continent. But I can support.
Whether it's Haiti or
Jamaica, but I can certainly support their determination to seek reparations. So I think that's really important too. We don't have to be divisive in this moment. We can support each other's work. We can learn more about the work that each of these different communities, these coalitions are doing, and cheer each other on. I think that's really important.
I just would mention the Haitian case is particularly interesting because Haiti was compelled to pay reparations to France, and we feel passionately that that money should go back to Haiti with interest. And that's another instance in which there's a specific relationship between the culpable party and the victimized community that needs to be addressed in a specific way.
But I would say too, one of the things that we have focused on, in a protracted way, is trying to, come to terms with this racial wealth gap. And I think that is something that all of these other countries might also want to explore, and not, perhaps they're also focused on an apology, perhaps they're focused also on research, but we would encourage them to also focus a considerable amount of their time and attention on eliminating the racial wealth gap for the people in their respective countries.
Well, Professors Mullen and Darity, I want to thank you for your time. It was a spirited hour, and I think
it was an important conversation.
Yes, conversation,
a vital conversation.
Yes. And once again, I want to encourage those who are in the audience to make sure you read From Here to Equality. It's an important book. It's an important contribution. It's an important intervention. I want to thank our guests for their time. I want to thank the audience for hanging in there with us. And I look forward to the next session that the Center for the Study of African Diaspora will host. I want to thank Ms. Taylor, the administrator of CSOD, for bringing everything together. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening and that this conversation will continue. So thank you so much, Kirsten and Darity. And Sandy. I do hope that I'll see you see you at some point in the near future.
And we as well. Thank you so much.